started. So yeah, welcome everyone from around the globe of this session of the UN 75 Global Governance Forum, entitled Active Creation, the Story of the UN's Founding. My name is Joris Larik. I'm assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands and a non-resident fellow and a senior advisor for the Justice Security 2020 program at the Stimson Center. I'm happy to introduce my co-moderator, Megan Roberts from the UN Foundation, where she is the Director of Policy Planning. So, well, as we commemorate UN 75, it's of course an opportune moment also to really go back straight to the beginning, so to UN 0, so to speak, or maybe even UN -1, -3, -5. And well, we have the privilege of really having the best possible person imaginable to take us there, Stephen Schlesinger. Before Megan will introduce him properly, let me say a word about the logistics for this session. Some of you might have already been in different sessions for this conference, but also and especially for the newcomers here. So we have plenty of time reserved at the end for a Q&A. So really encourage your questions and participation in this session. Do use for that, please, the Q&A function provided by Zoom. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see these two bubbles with Q&A written on them. That's where you can put your question. Please, we prefer if you don't do it anonymously, so do it with your name and maybe also your country where you're asking the question from. That'd be interesting to know as well. And of course, any questions. So you can type those up already while the lecture and Bill's response and the moderation is going on. So if you have a good question, just shoot it there and we will know about it then and can bring it up in the Q&A session. Okay, without much further ado, I'll hand over the floor to Megan.
Thank you so much, Joris, and I am just delighted to be here. As Joris mentioned, I'm Megan Roberts, Director of Policy Planning at the United Nations Foundation, and I am so excited for this discussion, which is incredibly timely, as Joris mentioned, as we look to the UN 75th anniversary. And I now have the really distinct honor of introducing our lecturer for this session, Steve Schlesinger. Steve is a fellow at the Century Foundation, and he's former director of the World Policy Institute at the New School and former publisher of the World Policy Journal. He previously served as Governor Mario Cuomo's speechwriter and foreign policy advisor, and also previously worked at UN Habitat. And Steve is the author of 3 books, including the subject of our discussion today, Active Creation, the Founding of the United Nations, which was published in 2003 and was awarded the 2004 Harry S. Truman Book Award. This fascinating book tells the real story of the founding of the United Nations, a tale of both extraordinary individuals and really extraordinary diplomacy that led to the signing of the UN Charter in San Francisco in 1945. Richard Holbrooke called this book a superb book that reconstructs this drama with great lucidity and illuminates its contemporary relevance. So we really could not have a better expert to take us through this incredible story. So I'll turn it over to Steve now, who will speak for about 25 minutes before we begin our discussion. So Steve, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Megan. And I'm delighted to be taking part in the Global Governance Forum. I think this is a wonderful occasion. This afternoon, I want to talk to you about the establishment of the United Nations 75 years ago. But let me say first, before I go any further, the UN's survival for this period of time is really a remarkable accomplishment for an international organization. As you may recall, the League of Nations lasted only about 20 years or so. Most global alliances have short shelf lives. The fact that the UN is still alive and kicking after so many decades is truly a unique achievement. Now, why has it endured for so long? This is really the subject of my talk today. I will be primarily focusing on the US role in the founding of the UN, which is only right since it was an American president, Franklin Roosevelt, who almost single-handedly brought about the UN's creation. Indeed, I'm always amused when I hear one of my fellow countrymen or elected officials, including even some of the US presidents, bashing the UN for this or that mistake and dismissing the body as unimportant, as if they do not realize that the United States was the nation which brought this extraordinary body into existence and in many ways gave a great gift to the world. So let me start. America, as you may know, has had a long tradition of avoiding involvement with the world community. Indeed, for the first 160 years or so of its existence, the US refused to join any global assemblage. The tale really begins back with the Puritans in the 17th century, sailing from Great Britain, who, once they arrived in the New World, turned their backs on what they saw as a corrupt Europe, set up separate communities of presumably pure virtue, and practiced their religion in virtual isolation. This is something sometimes called rugged individualism. Others might say it's the beginning of what we now call American exceptionalism, the notion that we, as the United States, is different from every other country because it possesses higher values and more formidable ideals. This distrust of foreign nations almost hardened into a doctrine when George Washington, our first president, warned his countrymen to, quote, steer clear of permanent alliances, end quote. And then Thomas Jefferson, another president, in his turn, decried, quote, entangling alliances, end quote, particularly as regards Europe. They did not necessarily, by the way, mean to hold back on trade with the rest of the world, but nonetheless, they adhered to the view that the US could act alone, unilaterally, without any so-called permission slip anywhere on the globe and do as it wished to protect its interests. That credo, in turn, in the US case, soon led in the 19th and early 20th centuries to dozens of interventions by America in Latin America and elsewhere. Then in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson, in the midst of the greatest conflict the planet had ever known, the First World War, attempted to break apart that hallowed tradition of standing alone and acting alone by the US. First, he sent American troops to Europe to help England and France to defeat the Germans. Then, as the war was ending, he introduced the concept of the League of Nations, the notion of an international security organization with worldwide membership set up to prevent the outbreak of all wars in the future. Wilson's idealistic plan really drew on our common geopolitical heritage, namely the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War in Europe, and the Congress of Vienna in 1815 following the Napoleonic Wars, along with a similar concept proposed in the 18th century by the great philosopher Immanuel Kant in his treatise Towards Perpetual Peace, in which he advocated that freely elected governments join together in a common federation for peace. In simplest terms, Wilson wanted a global assembly which would bring together all nations under international law to work in presumably harmonious cooperation to provide security for the world. But all this proved for naught. The US Senate, fearing infringement by the League on US sovereignty, refused to ratify the treaty. The Democratic presidential ticket of 1920, which might have kept the League in existence, went down to defeat. America soon entered a period of isolationism, which endured for years. In its turn, Washington reverted back to its old tried and true policy of staying aloof from foreign wars, while at the same time choosing to intervene in various spots abroad at its choosing whenever it felt its security or commercial interests were being threatened. Meantime, the League itself, with few exceptions, proved to be a disappointment. It performed poorly on the world scene, and this was due to three singular factors. First, every member state possessed a veto, so a single rogue nation could block any action by the League. Second, no League edict was binding on any other country, meaning that global cooperation was entirely voluntary. And third, the US never joined it, which meant the strongest nation on earth was not a member. Now, one of the most ardent supporters of the League in the Wilson years was a man named Franklin Roosevelt, who was then Assistant Secretary of Navy in his administration. In 1920, in fact, Roosevelt was the Democratic vice presidential nominee and had subsequently campaigned all over the country for the League. He had been shocked and profoundly disheartened by the voters' rejection, by the Senate's rejection of the security body. In the years that followed, nonetheless, he continued to believe in the signal importance of the League and hoped for its resurrection. After his election as President of the United States in 1932, 1932, he began to plot to bring back a League-like replica. But because of the strong isolationist sentiment prevailing in the US, he did not dare openly press for such a new global organization. It wasn't until 1939, 7 years after his accession to the presidency, as he saw the war clouds gathering in Europe and realized that another world war could happen, that he decided to pursue the founding of a new security body, but in secrecy, still fearful of an isolationist backlash. He instructed his State Department to quietly start to draft a new organizational framework for a security body. Then for the next 5 years, actually during the entirety of the Second World War, he and the State Department, with the help of some members of the US Congress, developed the principles and structure for this body. Simultaneously, he began to make a public case for the organization. He led what was at first a low-key crusade to arouse the American people to the need for a global US role. In January 1941, he delivered a State of the Union speech heralding what he called the four freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom of religion, and freedom from fear, asserting that these values were what US stood for and ones which the entire globe sought. And in the August of 1941, he and Winston Churchill issued a statement called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter that embodied these precepts and that, among other things, acknowledged the need for an international system of security. The following January, on New Year's Day in 1942, Roosevelt broadened his campaign for solidarity by bringing together 26 other countries to Washington, all of whom joined a wartime alliance against the Axis powers. There he devised a name for this group, the United Nations. In 1944, he persuaded Great Britain, the USSR, and China to co-sponsor a summit at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington to draft the preliminary UN Charter. And later, in February 1945, he met at Yalta with Stalin and Churchill and obtained their agreement to holding a conference in San Francisco in the spring of 1945 with 46 other nations to ratify the charter. On his return from Yalta, but before the San Francisco meeting, Roosevelt outlined to Congress his specific goals for the UN. The new organization, he said, quote, ought to spell the end of the system of unilateral action, the exclusive alliances, the balances of power, and all the other expedients that had been tried for centuries and always failed, end quote. Roosevelt indeed fundamentally wanted a body that he believed would prevent the outbreak of Third World War, all based on the concept of collective security. His mindset was that if the planet needed one thing and one thing only, it was security, security, security. This was after watching our world go through two catastrophic global conflicts, the First and Second World Wars, in which over 90 million people died. And for this, he was also willing to let all nations into this body, as long as they had opposed the Nazi regime, regardless of whether they were democracies or dictatorships. Given mankind's abysmal record, he felt countries had no other choice but to agree to a cooperative assembly. I should mention here parenthetically that Roosevelt did not at this time have to support the establishment of the United Nations. As the leader of the most powerful country on earth, he could have simply relied on the continuation of past nativist policy of unilateralism, joined with isolationism, with occasional allowances to build temporary coalitions. But the two world wars, as I said earlier, had convinced him that no nation could win a global conflict without allies. You needed a permanent multilateral alliance to defeat powerful enemies. Fortress USA was simply not enough. Now, in envisioning the bare bones of this institution, he and his team believed that it should retain certain features that were useful in the original League. First, there had to be a recognition that sovereignty was the crucial basis for the functioning of the organization, that it should be based on the ancient 1648 Westphalian principle that countries were their own sovereign territories. This meant, in essence, that the UN would be a collection of states, not elected representatives. Furthermore, there had to be essential military components and diplomatic components to fulfill the goals of this organization. Roosevelt also demanded, though, that there be a better balance between realism and idealism in the new body that had been true in the League. On the realism side, he believed the key to the new UN was realpolitik, namely keeping the successful anti-Nazi wartime alliance of Great Britain, the USSR, China, the United States, and France together. He saw these 5 states as what he called the natural policemen of the world, as the primary power brokers who should be making all the decisions on war and peace through the elite unit called the Security Council. The resolutions of that council on war and peace would be binding on all member states, meaning that once a country joined the UN, it automatically had to obey the dictates as issued by the council, different from the League, which had been on a voluntary basis. But most importantly, in Roosevelt's design, the 5 allies would be permanent members of the council, and they alone would have the veto power. No other member states would have that cudgel in hand, in stark contrast to the League, where, as I said, each country had the veto. Now, this change came about because Roosevelt felt that only these 5 nations had the manpower and military capabilities to serve as enforcers on UN missions. And since they would be risking the lives of their own soldiers in any UN endeavor, and since their own national interests would be involved, they should have the right to block any undertakings, military or otherwise, that they oppose. In short, he believed the UN could not operate effectively unless these 5 allies acted together. He simply did not feel that any of the other states had the strength or capacity to handle these responsibilities. And to make the role of these 5 nations especially effective in UN enforcement missions, he gave them all sufficient tools to carry out their work. In short, he endowed them with all sorts of permissible armed measures that could be employed to thwart aggressors. The charter thus contains some unusual militaristic language that you would not imagine for an organization that is always viewed primarily as a peacekeeping body. Read the text in Chapter 7 of the Charter. It allows the Security Council to undertake, quote, the interruption of economic relations of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communication, and the severance of diplomatic relations, end quote, to enforce a UN resolution. Furthermore, it approved, in addition, quote, all operations by air, sea, and land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security, end quote, including a blockade, among other measures. And it states that all members of the UN must be prepared to contribute their resources to these missions. Now, because of their central roles as enforcers, these 5 nations were also given broad authority under the veto. Not only could they block resolutions of the Security Council, but they would be allowed to shape almost all discussions on the Council, make the ultimate decisions on who would be the next Secretary General, decide when nations gained admission to the UN, determine which amendments to the UN Charter were acceptable, and most recently, okay whether cases of rights abuses should be sent to the International Criminal Court. But beneath the surface, the reason Roosevelt most strenuously sought the veto power was primarily for his own country. He knew without it, he could not otherwise get the US Senate to ratify the treaty, or for that matter, even obtain the support of the Soviet Union to participate in the organization. And all he remembered was that 25 years earlier, he had seen the League Treaty go down to defeat at the hands of the US Senate when its members decided that the League provisions had violated US sovereignty. Now, the veto clearly guaranteed that the US would always control its own way in the UN without interference. The presence of the veto, though, not surprisingly, caused an uproar at the San Francisco conference among the smaller states. They tried every stratagem in the book that they could find to eliminate the veto, or in the contrary, expand it to every country. However, in the end, these nations reluctantly acquiesced in the arrangement for the simple reason that the US and USSR literally threatened to walk out of the conference if they did not get their own way on these extraordinary powers. So the lesser states dropped their opposition and chose to believe that it was better that these two countries, as well as the 3 other permanent member states, remain inside the organization rather than stay outside of it, because a body like the UN simply would not survive without the participation of its most powerful members. Now, getting back to the other side of the Roosevelt ledger, namely the idealistic side, Roosevelt and his team proposed to give the smaller states their own forum, namely the General Assembly, where every state, regardless of its geographic size, population, wealth, military strength, and so on, would have a single vote. This gave some satisfaction to the beleaguered smaller countries. They now gained control over the UN's second most important organ, the General Assembly. And another gesture they earned, they won the authority over the UN's budget. And finally, also under the UN Charter, they gained protection against any interference with their domestic affairs. Still, the resolutions of the General Assembly, unlike the Security Council, were not to be binding on member states. Yet they have always and ever since carried significant moral weight around the globe. With this plan in hand, the US and its partners had in effect created a hybrid organization, one which is not truly democratic and is not an elected world government, has no taxing powers or legislative powers, but one which does have the sanction of the planet's states to provide strategic guidance to countries and uphold the moral values for the global community, and offer a meeting place and arena for differing views. Perhaps most importantly, though it was not evident at the time, the US and its partners in setting up the UN agreed on making the text of the Charter flexible and elastic enough, somewhat along the lines of the US Constitution, so that the body could deal with future crises that might not have been anticipated in 1945, so that the UN would have had wiggle room and creative space to develop new initiatives not mentioned in the original charter. Then, 13 days before the conference began, Roosevelt died, and the question hung in the air: what would happen to the meeting? For there was a new leader in the White House, an enigmatic and relatively unknown politician named Harry S. Truman. Truman was a former Democratic senator who had never attended college, had been abroad once in his life when he had fought in the First World War, and wasn't well known for a background in global affairs. But Truman, it turns out, was a true internationalist, and he saw the UN as the guarantor of peace in the post-war period. And from the day he first took office, he agreed to closely oversee the San Francisco conference. And in doing so, he had to surmount myriad crises at the conference to get it done successfully. For the conference itself turned out to be a very closely run thing. There were fights with the Soviet Union over the presidency of the conference. There was a threat of a walkout by the Latin nations if Argentina, which was considered a pro-Nazi country, was admitted or not. There were further Soviet demands over the admissibility of 2 countries that was in their perimeter of power, Ukraine and Belarus, and also Poland, and over the use of whether the veto should be absolute or not. All these struggles I indicated came along with the ones with the smaller states over the veto power itself. And finally, there was fights over whether the UN should also have regional bodies attached to it. But the conference succeeded. Why? I believe that in a sense, there really was no other choice. The mindset of the delegates in California in that spring of 1945 was self-evidently extremely anxious. Having seen the planet endure those 2 wartime catastrophes, the delegates in San Francisco simply could not accept the possibility of a third cataclysm. And this was even before they knew of the existence of the atomic bomb. So the emissaries to San Francisco single-mindedly constructed a viable global institution to head off further bloodshed, and from their point of view, frankly, save our species. All of the nations signed on to the Charter with all of its weaknesses and compromises. And in the United States, just a month after the conference ended, the US Senate approved the UN treaty by the overwhelming margin of 89-2. So on that note, I will end here and we'll look forward to a further discussion.
Thank you so much, Steve, for those fascinating remarks and telling that incredible story. There's so much to dig into there. And so I think you have given our discussant quite a lot to reflect upon. So I'm now so pleased to introduce our esteemed discussant, Bill Durge. Bill is a distinguished fellow with the Stimson Center. Prior to joining Stimson, he served as a foreign affairs officer with the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and in positions at the Harvard Center for Science and International Affairs and the Defense and Arms Control Study Program at MIT. Bill also served as project director for the landmark Panel on UN Peace Operations. Many of you will know the product of that panel's work, the Brahimi Report. And he now advises the United Nations and others on improving the effectiveness of peace operations. Bill, we're so lucky to have you here to offer some reflections on Steve's lecture, so please, over to you.
Thank you, Megan. Steve Schlesinger's careful reconstruction of the UN's formation highlighted the crucial importance of vision and drive, power and resources in making institutional change. The vision and drive were Franklin Roosevelt's, the power and resources were American. Roosevelt and then Truman were able to harness the resources of the US government at a time when it was geared up and funded to create strategic change, first on the battlefield, then in the post-war environment. The United States was the only major combatant to emerge from World War II with largely undamaged territory and industry. It had been the Allies' vital supplier and their essential rear area. I was struck in particular by Steve's description in his book of the nonstop transcontinental trains that carried conference delegates 3,000 miles from the US East Coast to San Francisco, seeing along the way countless undamaged fields and factories, in sharp contrast to the destruction many had left behind back home. It's one of the many parts of the UN creation story where the sheer weight of the US role in the UN's creation really struck home. It came about because Roosevelt wanted it, and the US could afford to underwrite that wish. But regarding today's most pressing global issues, pandemics and climate, the United States is in many ways just another afflicted party, needing to get its own act together. The diplomatic tussles at San Francisco also highlighted how the UN Charter was a product of major power politics and what the definition of major power was at that time. The empires of France, the UK, Portugal, and the Netherlands politically controlled most of Africa, all of Southeast Asia, and most of Southeast Asia. The organization's democratic deficit was essential to the original deal. But the Soviet Union was a prickly partner and would soon become more so. In fact, it's remarkable that the UN even survived the outbreak of the Cold War. That it did so speaks to its members' views of its utility. Washington continued to treat it as a serious, if not central element of its foreign policy for a quarter century. But as the UN's membership grew, the General Assembly grew more independent of Western wishes. The US in turn grew more diffident toward the UN from the 1980s onward, as the UN's majority asserted its voting power. The end of the Cold War gave the UN a chance to make a bigger difference in peace and security, and a less fractured Security Council embarked on ambitious peacekeeping operations, dealing not with the next world war of concern at San Francisco, but with complex local and regional wars. By the mid-1990s, UN operations had deployed either to implement peace agreements or to protect humanitarian relief in Cambodia, Somalia, Bosnia, and Rwanda, with such mixed and sometimes deadly results that the Council drew back for some years. But rebounding demand near the end of the century soon led to the ongoing deployment of more than 100,000 UN flag troops, police, and civilians to help manage political transitions or stabilize conflict-affected environments in such places as East Timor, DRC, Mali, and Haiti. The great risk in these deployments was and remains that the UN lacks the political leverage, let alone the ground power, to effectively enforce the deals that local parties reach if one or more of those parties does not act in good faith. This has left UN operations mired in difficult situations with scant prospect of exit. Not always, but often. Early on, the UN also moved beyond keeping the peace directly to address public health issues that transcend national borders and to help people stranded by disaster or conflict. UN agencies and programs came to play essential roles in these areas. Unicef vaccinates children. UNHCR offers care, protection, and resettlement to refugees. The World Food Program combats hunger. WHO coordinates the prevention and control of disease. The IAEA provides secure monitoring of nuclear materials and facilities to help prevent weapons proliferation. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its operational arm has been engaged for nearly 30 years to convince the world that it faces a severe climate crisis of human making. Its research arm, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has marshaled the best climate science to present increasingly hard to challenge evidence that humanity's success as a species and in the ways that success has been achieved to date is threatening humanity's future by altering the very background environment that humanity has used to grow and that it needs to survive. In 1945, the world witnessed an act of creation, the establishment of a global organization designed to keep the peace in several ways. What it now needs is an act of renewal, one that acknowledges the severity of the problems we face 75 years later and the urgent need to face them using every tool at our disposal, and that very much includes the UN system. I turn the floor back to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Bill, for those thoughts, which were incredible. And there's, again, lots to explore there. And before we move on to our Q&A and our discussion, Steve, we wanted to offer you the opportunity to respond first to Bill's remarks.
He says, I think that he actually touched on all the points that I think are very relevant to the United Nations today, particularly implicitly the lack of American involvement in the UN, the way it had been involved back in 1945 and had been for both in the 1950s and 60s and even into the 70s. But as the century drew to an end, 20th century drew to an end, it became more and more mired in local politics in the United States. Congress started withdrawing its support of the UN, particularly appropriations to the organization. And ever since then, it's been kind of a ebb and flow of feelings in this country about whether to support the UN or how to support it and what to do with it in the future. And so Bill did touch on all of those facets, and I would totally agree with him on what he said.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. I think we were going to, sort of assume co-moderator privileges and ask a few questions ourselves, but just want to encourage everyone who's tuning in to use the Q&A function to ask any questions. I see a few there, but please keep them coming. And Joris, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks Megan, and yeah, Stephen, Bill, thank you very much for your remarks so far. Yeah, please be reminded to use the Q&A function. I see some already teeing up there the questions. That's great to see. Before we turn to those, abuse, so to speak, our moderator role also with taking the opportunity to ask you both some questions as well that are on our minds, having reflected on your book, Steve, The Act of Creation, and on your remarks just now. So one thing that's certainly on my mind is, or that's certainly something that I think about was, in today's world, it always seems there's all these obstacles, everything seems so much more difficult. It's kind of the throwaway answer that any kind of reform proposal often gets, like, there's no political will, it's just too difficult. It always makes you think then, it used to be so much easier then. Making the UN Charter is just this kind of walk in the park, this piece of cake. But yeah, your book actually is a good refutation of that. So I would really invite you to tell us a bit more about some of these biggest risks in the final days of the San Francisco conference, where it could have all still gone wrong. I mean, how high would you actually say was the chance that we may have never seen the UN Charter come to life?
Well, I think it was a 50-50 proposition. You have to remember that the central issue here is you had to have an organizer. And in this case, it was Franklin Roosevelt. Without Roosevelt, there wouldn't have been a UN. There was no other country that had the wherewithal to pull this together. And also, there was no other leader who really felt as strongly as Roosevelt did about having a new international security body. So first of all, you had to have an organizer, and that turned out to be Roosevelt. Second of all, Roosevelt himself had to overcome the obstacles of isolationists in his own country just to get to the point of putting together a plan for a UN. And then you had the problems of the USSR and Great Britain. Stalin really didn't care particularly for the UN. He wanted to have, if best, a regional organization, which is, or at least one, an organization which had very little real power around, or authority around the world, except for the alliance that had won the war against the Nazis. Great Britain under Churchill also wanted a regional kind of type organization. He didn't want a universal type security body. But eventually Roosevelt was able to convince them to go along. Then Roosevelt, also had to put up with the fact that Stalin wanted to have 16 votes in the General Assembly because of those 16 states that were now dominated by the Soviet Union. And he had to fight back against Stalin on that issue, and finally got Stalin to agree to only ask for 2 votes in addition to the Russian vote, which is Ukraine and Belarus, and that actually he approved of. So that was just the beginning, and then there had to be a date for the meeting, and Roosevelt decided, with the agreement of Churchill and Roosevelt, to do it in April before the war ended. Why? Because he felt that if the war ended and they had the meeting after the war, a lot of nations wouldn't bother to show up because they'd be so preoccupied with trying to rebuild their own societies that they wouldn't take this idea of a universal security body seriously. On the other hand, so he wanted to do it before the war ended. So that's one reason he did in April. And also, he didn't want to do it too soon because if he did it before he got all the other powers lined up, Russia and the Soviet Union and England and China and France, he knew that they couldn't put together a sponsorship group that would make this a viable project. Then he gets to San Francisco and he realizes that a lot of these countries can't even afford the plane flights to get to San Francisco. So he supplies US wartime planes to fly the delegates in from a lot of these countries that didn't have any transportation to get to San Francisco. So that was another issue that had to be dealt with, just the financial wherewithal to bring them all together. And with the US itself, he had to put together a delegation which was balanced between the 2 great parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, because otherwise the Republicans who had defeated the League back in the 20s would not feel fully invested in the project of the UN. So he did that. That was another issue that had to be dealt with. And then once he got to San Francisco, there was the big fight about the veto between the smaller states and the 5 permanent powers, which had to be resolved. Then there was a fight between Stalin and the US about whether the veto should be absolute or allow for at least the issue of crises being discussed at the Security Council. That finally got resolved by a quick meeting that Truman arranged between Stalin and Harry Hopkins. So you don't have an absolute veto today. You're allowed to bring a crisis to the Security Council without any of the 5 powers vetoing that possibility. And then the Latin nations threatened to walk out of the meeting unless Argentina was admitted, which had been a pro-Nazi country. Finally, that got resolved, and in exchange for Argentina be admitted, Belarus and Ukraine were invented. So there were all these different issues that had to be worked through in a diplomatic way with a certain amount of threats and intimidating language and so on, to get to the point where you actually had those 50 countries in San Francisco finally working on a final draft of the charter. Then the big issue was once the charter was signed, you had to then send it back to all these different countries to have their legislations or congresses or parliaments ratify the treaty. So in the end, there were a lot of different steps that had to be taken. And I would tell you right now, you could not do that today. There is no way you would get 193 countries to agree on something like this today.
All right, thanks very much. There's a lot of obstacles, a lot of risks. Yeah. All right, Megan, did you want to ask a question as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And Bill, I just wanted to make sure you didn't want to come in on that question.
No, I'm good.
Okay, great. So we've mentioned already a few times today in our conversation that, this year we're commemorating the 75th anniversary of the UN, and for several years, but for many years, but especially this year, there are many calls for and discussions on the need to reform the institution, that it's out of touch with reality, that it doesn't reflect the world today, that it's failed to live up to the principles of the charter, many criticisms. What insights do the negotiations to initially create the charter, and you've talked a little bit about this already, but those negotiations to create the charter and create the UN offer for reform discussions today? What can we learn from those?
I would say that we learned that power politics still plays a big role at the UN. And we're stuck at this point with 5 countries have the veto. And that means that those 5 countries have a huge, vast authority over how the UN operates. And every year, as you probably know, there's always an effort by UN membership to reform the Security Council, to broaden it, to bring in states that have grown in strength and military prowess on an equal footing with the other 5 countries. For example, Brazil or India or Japan or Germany and so on. And yet, every time a reform effort is undertaken, it always gets defeated, because in the end, one of those 5 veto countries refuses to go along with the effort. They don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up their authority. They're sitting pretty on that council, and they may pay lip service from time to time about, well, I think the U.S. wants to bring in Japan, or another country might want to bring in India and so on, but nothing ever happens. So I think the biggest problem with the UN, quite aside from the other issues you've raised, is the question of what do you do about the Security Council? And that also gets to your issue about whether it's now lacks real legitimacy for what it does, because it doesn't represent the powers of 2020, the power realities of 2020, as opposed to as what they were in 1945. That is something that has, in my view, great difficulty dealing with. I just have worked this through in my mind again and again. I don't see any give or leeway that is going to change this situation, at least in the immediate future.
All right, thanks very much. Well, I see we have a lot of different audience questions already teed up. So what I would suggest is to actually switch to the Q&A, unless there's another urgent question from Megan's side. But if not, okay, in that case, yeah, I think it's great to see the volume of audience participation. Yes, I don't want to miss any of these questions and give or miss the opportunity for Steve and Bill to react to them. I might have to group them a little bit because it's already at 16 questions. But let me start with some of them. Really, yeah, they continue this theme of, yeah, what can we learn from the history of the UN for its way forward? So it's well, I guess it does relate to this question also of eventually the P5 and in many ways how to go around them if necessary or if that's possible at all to get any reforms done. So a few of the questions that we received were from Arthur Dahl, the question, what room is there for UN reform short of changes in the Charter itself? So what can we do in the absence of Charter reform? On Charter reform, also from Vasilin Popovsky, the question, yeah, whatever happened to that review conference 10 years, Article 109 of the UN Charter that you also mentioned was discussed, was a big issue in San Francisco, but yeah, whatever happened to that? Why exactly was that, even though the language was so clear in the Charter itself? And then let me also add another one in that debate from Corey Buart. Yeah, given the undermining by the US, so having seen the changed stance of the US from creator to say underminer, yeah, how is there anything else from adapting the UN into something different, like an entity, as he calls it, that can behave compassionately and rationally completely, rather than trying to continue this counterproductive diplomatic judging act that we often see in the present? So that's already, yeah, some questions we got on UN that I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts on, Stephen and Bill.
Well, Bill, maybe you want to take that first, and then I'll follow up.
Okay. Review conference. Well, 1955, height of the Cold War, U.S. was more worried about the bomber gap than it was about changing the UN. And I think it kind of became a moot point. Very little decolonization at that point. The West was pretty much dominant in the GA still, so I imagine they didn't see any reason to change it. With regard to power politics and still playing the primary role as opposed to having a more, I don't know, what was it, compassionately and rational organization. What I was saying about the definition of major powers in 1945 and the permanent five, that kind of morphed from the original definition and the existence of imperial powers being among the P5 to the five original nuclear armed powers. That became the new big stick as opposed to sort of general geopolitical heft. And on the other hand, the five nuclear powers have not demonstrated any inclination to expand the veto to other nuclear powers as other countries acquire the bomb. So, as Steve very well put it, in that sense, the organization is a bit frozen, but it has also over time, the members have figured out how to accomplish things without needing to modify the charter, except to expand the Security Council once without adding the number of veto wielders. And I'm thinking of things like in the environment, like the Montreal Protocol, and I'm sure I'm going to miss things, other things that people could mention, or the Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, the Kyoto Protocol that followed on that, all of the things I was mentioning that the UN has broadened out into, that it does, that are extremely useful and helpful to many vulnerable communities in the world, that you can do without either going through the Security Council or amending the charter. So I think that's how we managed to walk our way forward so far. You know, whether it's going to be sufficient in the future, not clear. But I think it's more likely, should we once again see greater US and other leadership on something like climate change, which we're going to have to do, that we might be able to get beyond the voluntary nature of an agreement like Paris from 2015 to something that is more binding, but not having to amend the UN Charter to do it, but to just do that on its own, so that you might see a series of binding agreements and the organizations that develop to implement them evolve as we begin to take such issues seriously. Going back to the original organization, I'm not sure, but I tend to be a constructive pessimist, and I'm sometimes pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I might add here that I would agree with Bill. I think that the UN has membership has learned in many ways to work around the 5 veto countries in ways that amplify the strengths of the UN. For example, in peacekeeping, of course, that had to be approved by the 5 veto countries, but it did allow the UN to start taking responsibility for a lot of conflicts around the world, and in a way that it introduced the idea of the UN as a arbiter, as a conciliator in disputes that otherwise might have spun out of control had the UN not gotten involved. And then there have been, UN has taken on responsibilities that were not mentioned in the charter, like nation building or election monitoring or arms inspection. These kind of things kind of organically evolve because these needs have to be dealt with. And so the UN is there to kind of respond to these urgent requests from world states that have to be addressed in new ways that, as I said, were not part of the original makeup of the UN Charter, but given the flexibility of the Charter itself, the UN has been inventive enough and it sort of reinvented itself from decade to decade to deal with issues that it didn't realize it would be confronting before. And so I think that that gives a sense of resonance to the UN that may not, but that tends to get overshadowed by the media concentration on the fights in the Security Council. Most of the media coverage is on the Security Council. A lot of the agencies that Bill just mentioned get very little coverage unless they get into a fight like between Trump and the World Health Organization. Suddenly WHO becomes a prominent headline in the world newspapers. But the UN is doing so, I would suspect that almost 90% of what the UN does is surface kind of work. And the other 10% has to do with the security issues. And so there's a lot of the UN that remains submerged and yet is the vital part of the way the organization operates.
All right, thanks very much to both of you. I have another kind of, I think, group of questions that fit nicely together here for the two of you. And yeah, in a way, we continue with the theme of what can we learn from then for the way forward for the UN. But it's a bit more specifically about maybe some of the partners and forces that are not fully in the limelight. I think one thing both of you stressed was that this US leadership in the founding of the UN, because they had to, because they could. But still, even at that moment, it wasn't the only player around. And maybe one question or a series of questions here from various of the participants, of Alana O'Malley from Ireland and from the University of Leiden, Dan Perel as well. So they're all asking, what about, yeah, basically what about other countries, especially countries that today we would consider global South countries? It's a big term, but yeah, maybe let me start this way. Did any sense of that exist at the time of yeah, what we would call today global South countries? For instance, what about India as a country, still a British colony, not independent yet, but with there in San Francisco as well? Maybe see if you could tell us something about, they must have had the sense that, well, we will be independent sooner or later, we will be a big, powerful country, certainly not a population. Should we not have already a more prominent role, even as perhaps a leader of what would ultimately become the global South or the non-aligned movement later? And maybe to add to that also, there's also a question about China. I saw, yeah, China also, you mentioned it in the book, but yeah, it's also still the Republic of China government, but also, yeah, always a bit on the sidelines, it seems. So can you shed a bit more light on that? Maybe let's start with that at San Francisco or in the whole drafting process. Basically, I think this boils down to, yeah, where is the global South in all of this, or what we would call today the global South?
Well, I think the UN in San Francisco did address the issue of the states which were still under colonial possession or colonial possession, when they set up the Trusteeship Council, which became, in many ways, an effective organ of the UN in helping the transition from colonialism to independence for many of the countries that eventually became sovereign nations. And it's actually one of the, I think, marks of great success by the UN is that the Trusteeship Council did play a role in helping these nations gain their independence in a way that helped prevent the outbreak of too much conflict in the transition of a state into a kind of its own sovereignty. So the UN was set up in that sense to realize that colonialism was coming to an end, and Roosevelt himself was a great anti-colonialist and had many different issues with people in France and England about whether they would give up their colonies eventually. So this was part of the atmosphere in San Francisco in 1945. I don't think, though, that the P5, the 5 veto countries, were fully cognizant of the fact that you suddenly were going to have this explosion of independent countries coming in the late 50s and the 1960s, which would shift the balance of power in the General Assembly away from the more dominant Western states and the Soviet Union. And so I think that has been something that each of those 5 countries have had to adjust to in order to maintain a sense of position at the UN that they had back in 1945. Now, on the issue of China, China really was not a player in 1945. It was devastated by a civil war. And one of the only reasons that it became part of the discussion to be part of the permanent 5 membership at the sponsoring powers was that Roosevelt was very concerned with the country which had the largest population in the world not being considered and recognized as a potential big power. And he basically forced that issue through over somewhat a concerned Soviet Union and a somewhat reluctant Great Britain, and made China part of the original discussion in 1944 in a kind of separate, China was not at the Dumbarton Oaks session itself. It was only brought in about a month later at a separate special session, which allowed China to become part of the 5 membership sponsoring powers. So China was never seen in 1945 physically and because of the wreckage of the Civil War as a power at the time, but it was seen as a potential one, and that was why it finally got recognition that Roosevelt insisted on. But again, as you can see, everybody was trying to recover from the Second World War, and there were a lot of different themes of how you deal with potential and non-potential authorities, and how do you bring them all together in a San Francisco kind of conference so that they all agree on this charter. It was not as I said, it was a close run thing.
Okay, thanks very much for those responses to that cluster of questions. Actually, just do one follow-up cluster on this. Once again, looking more to the future, on which I wanted to bring both of you in. Is some of our participants here are asking, okay, so this is a very good account of just the political situation, the power balance of power back then. And they played it out the right way to get the charter done. But what kind of an alliance would we need today, given the current circumstances? Bill, you said yourself now the US is just another afflicted country in the world. I think that were your words. And some of our participants are saying, well, so Jeffrey Huffings is saying, well, if the US is withdrawing even more from the UN, just defunding the UN, maybe now China will develop an interest in it and take over. Is that something to look forward to, something to bet on? And perhaps also, yeah, what other forces would you, both of you, say need to be galvanized for any change of the UN for the future? Also state, but also non-state actors. Steve, I know you mentioned very insightful also to read about the role of non-state actors in San Francisco. But yeah, what about the role of also non-state actors today in UN reform efforts?
Bill?
Shall I do this first? Okay. Yeah. For a while, I was making it a practice of following budgets. It was related to peacekeeping dues and things. But 20 years ago, the Chinese contribution to the assessed UN budget was under 1% of the total budget. And now, I haven't looked in a little while, but it's at least 19%. So they have, their contribution to the UN over the last 20 years has gone up by a factor of 20 as the country's economy has developed. And at the same time, by contrast, 20 years ago, the Japanese, as I recall, used to be assessed 20% of the budget, and now it's 10. So the economic and by implication power status of certainly those two countries in Asia has flipped in 20 years. My reading of China is that it is a very pragmatic power, not especially interested in democracy, not especially interested in human rights as the West has defined them. Very proud of the progress economically that it has made in the last 2 generations. And if you go back, let's say, to the mid-60s and the Cultural Revolution and all of that, and you contrast the life of the average Chinese citizen then and now, there's a huge difference. So they have a great deal of, I think, investment in the world trading system, in the environment, in a number of issues of common interest. Now, whether they would have a similar approach to security issues, not clear, but they have contributed a number of very well-trained units to UN peacekeeping, not nearby Chinese borders, but that's common practice for the Burm 5 when they contribute. So I think it's going to be, the rise of China makes it a mixed bag as to what we might expect in terms of UN focus and influence and what the Security Council might decide. I don't rule out the United States actually making a comeback, right, in multilateral affairs. I would say stay tuned and call me again in 6 months and see what we'll say then.
We will,
well,
but over to you, Steve.
I certainly would agree with what Bill was saying, and I think that it's quite remarkable that as part of President Trump's America First policy, that he's symbolically chosen the UN to express his desire to go it alone. I mean, he's withdrawn from UNESCO. He's left the Human Rights Council. He helped cut $500 million off the peacekeeping budget. He obviously pulled away from the Paris Treaty on Global Warming. He's now started the process of withdrawing from WHO, the World Health Organization. All of this is an expression of a kind of right-wing nationalism in the United States. And what it has done, he may regard it as strengthening the U.S. in the world. Actually, it's weakened the U.S. in the world, because the U.S. used to be a major influence for good, I think, in the United Nations in all the different areas that he's withdrawn from. And it gets back to the issue of the so-called often dreaded idea of American leadership. Well, American leadership is for real. I mean, people around the globe have admired American leadership on the issues that are virtuous, on human rights, on trying to prevent the outbreak of war, on peacekeeping, on health, on a lot of cross regional issues and global treaties of various sorts. So what is missing is now being, the missing leadership in the United Nations is now being fulfilled in part, as Bill pointed out, by China. Not only has China increased its contributions to the peacekeeping budget, it's taken over second place to the US in terms of its contribution to the annual budget of the United Nations. Second place, which used to be Japan's spot. US, as you know, contributes 22% of the annual budget. China now contributes 12.5%. And it's moved into a lot of different positions in the various agencies of the United Nations. And frankly, it is using the organization in a kind of defensive way to ward off any interference in what they regard as in internal affairs. And there's nobody to counter it. The US has basically stayed on the sidelines. And I think that's going to hamper the UN's ability to act the way we all thought it would act in 1945 in the future, if China is allowed to basically insert its people in the various key positions in the UN hierarchy.
Okay, thanks very much for those responses. I think I have some more here that link up to that. We talk about India, we talk about China, very populous countries, and also see some questions here on my list, which actually talk about democratic accountability. So maybe that's an interesting segue into that whole area. You said yourself, Steve, that this democratic or lack of our democratic deficit was kind of part of the UN's original DNA. Yet there are calls for more democratic accountability also at the UN level. So we have a question from Lars Lünenburger, which says, was something missed in San Francisco or Dumbarton or Oaks? Not having more of a directly elected world parliament, for instance. And yeah, it does make me think, if we say the US was so powerful, so overbearing in the whole process, couldn't it have also instilled more of American values in terms of democracy into the UN? And a similar question or a similar point also from Ted Daly in California is, well, in the long run, maybe an organization like that cannot be a sustainable solution. So eventually, don't we have to move to what he calls a genuine world republic? But I would assume that also is something with stronger democratic credentials.
Well, I would agree with the questioner that there should have been more democratic virtue in the 1945 San Francisco Conference. But Roosevelt was a realist. He realized that this organization could not survive without including the Soviet Union. After all, the Soviet Union and the United States were the great victors of the Second World War. And so in order to get the Soviet Union to participate in the founding of the organization, he had to kind of evade the issue of democracy. He had to allow the Soviet Union come in as a dictatorship. But he was primarily interested in the issue of security. And he realized security meant that you had to deal with bad guys as well as good guys to prevent the really evil guys. That is, after all, is how they won the Second World War. The democratic Western countries had to still work with a totalitarian regime in Moscow in order to win the Second World War. And that was the only way that they defeated the Nazis. And so there was a feeling that using that same kind of realism was necessary to make possible the creation of the UN. Now, I think implicit in the idea of setting up the organization was the notion that eventually, as peace was evolving in the decades afterwards, once the UN was in existence, that more democracies would become members of the UN, and that eventually the Soviet Union itself would change and become more democratic. So I think there was a implicit feeling that that was the way you started towards a more democratic future. But you first had to set up an organization to kind of reflected those values, even if the membership itself didn't reflect them.
All right, okay. Bill, do you want to come in on the theme of democratic accountability as well?
Well, I think I would probably echo Steve's remarks that in the circumstances, it was, I think they managed to do as much as they could do. One could make the same argument about all of the trusteeship factors and the non-self-governing territories. And the similar approach was taken there, and over time they did become self-governing with varying degrees of violence and bloodshed and acquiescence on the part of their metropoles. So the number of members certainly increased, and for a while democracy increased. I think if you look at the stats on how polities were rated over the intervening 75 years, and we kind of peaked maybe around the turn of the century and then have begun to backslide a bit, and that is troubling. But there really wasn't any prospect at the beginning of having the kind of democratic accountability that I think many people would have liked to have seen and would like to see now. And this is not really my bailiwick, and I tend to run pessimistic on the ability of reform to shake loose the really most deeply rooted tendencies of states. And again, as I said before, one way to do this is not just for non-state actors to try and have greater influence on the organization, but to do things within the system that will get you results without having to change the system utterly, that produce results that are democratically hopeful and support human rights and so forth. And then there's circumvention. Most of the agreements and processes that I mentioned before came out of General Assembly resolutions, not Security Council resolutions. And if you can make that work, then you've got a lot of mileage on the potential democratization of UN decision making. And then you set up the processes within those organizations such that they work as well as they can and maybe better than the parent. That's the best thing I see in the short term, certainly with the political trends in the world as they are. And I'd like to be able to give a more optimistic assessment, but I don't think I can right now.
Thank you so much, Bill and Steve. We have 2 more questions that I think are related and would love to hear your thoughts on them. First, from Rachel Mutangana from Cape Town. She's a law student. And she asked, how do we keep young people all over the world, especially those from the least developed countries, interested in the core values of the UN and carrying on the legacy of the UN? You know, we're here on at the 75th anniversary. What about the 100th anniversary, the 150th anniversary of the UN? And especially as we're thinking about, you know, living in a world with the largest youth cohort that we've ever had. What does that mean for thinking about rallying support for the UN? And perhaps as part of that, a fantastic question from Alana O'Malley, what gaps remain in our understanding about the history of the UN, and how does that affect current discussions about the UN? How does that shape our thinking about the UN? And how does that affect our debates around reform and what's possible today?
Well, I think that on the issue of young people, one of the best things that came out of the 1945 San Francisco conference was the setting up of different organizations that related to the UN. United Nations Association, which is now part of the UN Foundation, they were branches set up all over the United States that brought to the attention of young people the importance of this organization, leading to the Model UN conferences that still take place on an annual basis, both in high schools and in colleges, and I think have been replicated around the world. I often speak at the conference that comes here in New York, and there are delegations of young people literally from almost every country that is a member state of the United Nations. To the extent that that kind of work is done in your own country by the young people who can kind of connect to similar type organizations that believe in the purposes and goals of the United Nations itself, I think that is a great way to both maintain the central importance of the UN in a particular country, and also involve young people in the idea of participating in UN activities. As I said, through the Model UN, and maybe when they get out of college, they might try to get a job at the United Nations itself. And so it's very important to maintain that UN visibility within your own country. I think that'd be the first thing that I would recommend. It's also always important to be in touch with your own UN mission at the United Nations, and try to deal with them as a kind of connection that might help in the future if you do want to get involved in international affairs. Now, on the history of the UN and the gaps that were addressed by the questioner, I mean, to me, the biggest gap is the misunderstanding that still goes on in the UN as to why the 5 countries that are now the veto members of the Security Council came into being. There is terrific resentment against that. I totally understand it, but frankly, if they had not come up with the formula they did in 1945, there wouldn't have been a UN today. There just wouldn't have been an organization that would be viable enough to have survived for 75 years. So the real issue is facing the fact that right now you can't do anything about that particular structure in the UN itself. How do you work around it? To me, that's the crucial issue. Working around the UN Security Council. You can do it through the General Assembly, as Bill mentioned. There are ways to do it through regional groups. The NGOs can play a role. A lot of the outside ideas, the ideas come from the outside that the UN eventually adopts. So there are ways, it's a porous organization. There are ways of getting to the UN itself and influence it. And I think that if you can get by the issue of the Security Council and that structural defect of the 5 countries, there are many inventive routes that you can take to have an impact on the UN. And I think that has been proven again and again through the decades.
Yeah, Bill, please.
Hesitate to actually advise youth on anything because I'm so far removed from youth. But, and I will get right back to that. I wanted to echo Steve's comment on the veto. And just remember, the veto can only stop things. You don't get to do anything extra if you've got the veto. You can only stop things. And it was designed to stop things from happening that were not in the veto wielder's interest, right? So that the UN couldn't rear up and invade the USSR or vice versa. In terms of the question specifically on youth, one thing I might suggest is that people consider working for UN field agencies or for NGOs that work with field agencies, learn how the issues look on the ground in whatever their field of interest is: human rights, food, women's status, disease, conflict, I suspect there are lots of open positions. Figure out how it works, how it looks, either work your way up the chain or go someplace else that's more congenial. Approach the power structure from the side, coordinate that, now that you know what you're really doing and what it looks like. And I think over time, you may find considerable change has been effected. At least that's one way to do it.
All right, thanks very much to both of you. We are technically out of time, but maybe if I can steal another 3 minutes from you, because I see there's also some clarifying questions, also some that were quite early on in the debate that I don't want to sweep under the carpet. One clarification question for Steve was from, let me see. From Richard Jordan. He's asking, the first meeting of the General Assembly occurred in London at Westminster. I suppose the question is also why that was, if that's true, why that was the case, with the UN headquarters being in New York. And was it not that the Security Council met a week later to adopt its rules of procedure?
Well, London was, apparently, my understanding, London agreed to provide the facilities for the opening of the UN because no other country at that particular point was in the position to do so. The really interesting question is, why did the UN end up in New York? And the most interesting part of that discussion was that in many ways, the countries that made the decision on placing the UN in the United States, eventually New York, did so because they were so fearful that if the UN was put in another country outside of the United States, that the US would retreat into isolationism again and eventually leave the United Nations and destroy it the way they had destroyed the League of Nations. They felt if they had it in an American city, it would be much more difficult for the US to retreat from the UN, to kind of refute the whole idea of an international body. And therefore, they insisted on having an American city be the host city for the central UN headquarters. I don't think a lot of people realize it. Anyways, they think the US dominated the discussion about it, but in fact, it was fear of the US retreating into isolationism again that brought about its placement in New York. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the other part of that question.
Unmute here. The other part was, yeah, that then the Security Council met a week later to adopt its rules of procedure.
Yes, it was done in London. Is that the question that was asked? I'm not sure what he meant by that.
Yeah, I think so. Unless Jordan wants to qualify it in the chat. But now I think, oh yeah, you answered the question. All right, perfect. Excellent. I think, yeah, I'm sorry, we'll have to wrap it up. We're already over time. I think we could go on for a long time. I'm very sorry for any questions we didn't get to fully. I'm just saying it's amazing to see all these questions coming in really from all over the world here. That's really amazing. Let me thank also on behalf of my co-moderator Megan, Steve, and Bill very much for your contribution. It's been a real pleasure, a real highlight, even among the highlights of UN 75. So thank you very, very much. Maybe what I would like to close with are 2 points, also an encouragement for all of you who stay on for the next session, community-based session on global cooperation in the face of increasing ecological threats, something we haven't gotten to in this session too much. So stay tuned on the presentation of the key findings of the Ecological Threat Register by the Institute of Economics and Peace. Yeah, I really like to close with a note on what struck me, one of the many things, but one thing that struck me in particular about the book Act of Creation was, yeah, that a book like that, this kind of comprehensive, authoritative report or account of something as important as the founding of the UN, only came out in 2003. I mean, I acknowledge it's hard to do it as well as Steve did it, but still it amazes me that the world had to wait so long for a book like that. So in closing, I'd just like to say, I hope we really don't have to wait until the early 22nd century to read about an authoritative account of UN 75, or hopefully also UN 100. So it's especially to the young scholars and writers and historians out there, you have no excuse. You can read Steve's book, then you know how it's done, and we shall be looking forward to more of those kinds of books, hopefully. So thanks very much, and I wish you all a good continuation of the conference, a nice evening continuation of your day. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.